looking at what are the myths and the beliefs that I grew up with. Where did those come from? Who gave me those messages? What purpose did they have for giving me those messages? Like maybe what were they trying to get across to me? Like maybe they were trying to.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
Everyone, welcome to this special episode of Get Your Marriage On. I'm pleased to have as my guest Dr. Camden. She's a clinical psychologist with a PhD and is in the middle of writing a really interesting book that I think will appeal to all of you. Welcome today.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Tell me about your background, how you grew up, and what inspired you to do the work you're doing now.
Okay, yeah, like you said, I'm Dr. Camden Morgante. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice in Knoxville, Tennessee as a therapist, and then I do some writing and speaking and teaching college classes in psychology when I'm not at my practice. And I'm in Knoxville. I live here with my husband and our 2.5-year-old daughter. So
That's exciting.
yeah, so balancing work and family life, and then all my like passion projects on the side with my writing and things. So I'm writing
very busy, don't you?
Yes, yeah, lots of balls in the air when you've got work and a family, and yeah. So I'm writing a book right now on purity culture, as you said, and it's some research and some writing projects I've been working on for several years now. I got the idea because I grew up in purity culture, and we'll talk about what that is, and I'll explain that more. But I grew up in that culture and with those belief systems as an evangelical Christian, and that was just the church teachings and the culture that was instilled in me. And then as I grew up and went to college, and more so after college, started questioning these beliefs, because I saw that a lot of the promises that I was given, if I remained sexually pure or abstinent before marriage, a lot of those promises ended up being false promises for me, ended up just not coming true and not panning out the way that I expected them to be. So that led me to a few years of really considering my beliefs and exploring what the Bible says about sex and the purpose of sex and what are Christian sexual values. But the whole time I still maintained my identity as a Christian, and I still maintained my belief in abstaining from sex before marriage. And then I met my husband. We got married when we were almost 30, so quite a bit later than most of my peers here in the Southern Christian evangelical world I live in, and had our daughter. And so so it's been a journey of seeing the harm that has come, not just to myself through my faith. That really challenged my faith, but also with the therapy clients that I work with, and seeing how it created a lot of shame for them and a lot of sexual problems and issues. And because I believe that premarital sexual abstinence is biblical and is what God wants for us, it started me thinking, like, how can we hold on to that belief and hold on to those values, but to leave behind the myths and the shame that purity culture also brought along with it. So that's been my passion and my work right now.
That's cool. So you've been through a crisis of faith, you've been through ups and downs, and now you're here trying to help others navigate and, stay strong through it all.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Japan and Hawaii, so I really wasn't immersed in that purity culture like you have. Can you describe some of the elements or some of the telltale signs, I guess you could say, of those things, the good and the bad, and so?
Yeah, it's been really interesting as I've studied purity culture and historically how it came about, because as with every movement in history, you see how the previous decades kind of laid the foundation for it. So purity culture was mostly a movement in the later 1990s and early 2000s in more conservative Christianity, the belief of premarital sexual abstinence, but the cultural artifacts that went along with it. So for many people, myself included, this was a true love waits ring, making a virginity pledge. Some people attended rallies or balls, like purity balls. some people made pledges not to date until they were married. I read the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and some people vowed not to kiss until marriage. So there was just lots of extra stuff that went along with this value system and this belief. And if you look back historically, you see that the sexual revolution and kind of the feminist revolution of the 70s started to make a lot of conservative Christians really scared and nervous about this. And then you had the AIDS crisis of the 80s. And then you had this switch to very conservative family values and abstinence-only sex education later on in the 90s. And then, like I said, into the 2000s. And when I was a teenager, when I was growing up, and when I went to college was the later 2000s. So yeah, so all of that set the stage for this belief system that now most people no longer subscribe to. And so what I think was good about it is that there was maybe well intentions for most people. There was good intentions to protect young people from AIDS and STDs or STIs, from teenage pregnancy, as there was a boom in that in the 90s, and from broken heart, getting your heart broken, or and just to hopefully instill the value of sex in marriage. But sometimes it was built up so much that it became like an idol, that sex in marriage became like an idol and became this kind of carrot that they're dangling to try to convince young people to abstain until marriage. And like I said, well, I think that's a good and truthful pursuit. I don't agree with a lot of the harm that came along with purity culture, and that's the work that I'm trying to undo now.
Gotcha. Did you get the sense that a lot of those messages are coming more out of fear than out of I don't know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the messages were very motivated by fear, the fear of some of the repercussions of premarital sex, like we mentioned, and also just the fears of wanting young people to conform and to adhere to these biblical values. But it instilled a lot of fear in people too. I get messages a lot from especially women with these fears that, oh, if I had premarital sex, then no one's going to want me, and God won't forgive me, and it's the unforgivable sin. Or there's this fear that yeah, if I do have sex, I'm damaged goods, or and then shame. There's a lot of shame, and along with that fear of, well, if I don't get married, if I don't find someone, then something's wrong with me because I've played by the rules. So why haven't I, met someone? So yeah, so definitely fear and shame were huge tools used in the purity movement.
Good. What are some other myths that you've uncovered or found through your experience and through all your work?
Yeah, so in my research, and I've got an article I've written called 5 Purity Culture Myths. So I've narrowed it down to these 5 most prevalent myths. The first one is called the spiritual barometer myth, and that's the myth that our spirituality and our maturity as Christians can be measured by if we were virgins before marriage or not. So that being a virgin before marriage automatically makes you a good Christian, and if you weren't, then you weren't as good of a Christian, basically. And we know that that's just not true, and that breeds a lot of pride for people who did wait until marriage, but also a lot of shame for people who don't. It's not necessarily true that that's a marker of good Christianity or not. While there could be some truth in, if our faith is really deep and genuine, we're going to try to make choices that are aligned with our faith. There is some truth to that. But it's not true that it's an automatic measure of how good of a Christian we are. There's certainly other beliefs and other practices that are more important and count for more, I think, in God's eyes.
Are you discounting the importance of chastity in saying that?
I'm not. I think, like I said, if our faith is really genuine and deep, and if we have thought about and adhere to this value as I did, I really explored and decided, yes, I do believe this. This is something I want to hold on to. Then I think there's a lot of value to that, and there's a lot of good that can come from that, from honoring God with our bodies and from obeying God's teachings. But I just don't agree with the shame that it puts on people who do make sexual mistakes or sins, or especially for people who experience sexual assault that wasn't their choice. but because of what's happened to them, they automatically see themselves as damaged goods or less valuable or worthy in God's eyes, and that's just not true.
No. That's kind of contrary to the underlying Christian ethic, don't you think?
Well, it's contrary to grace and forgiveness.
Exactly. Right,
Mhm.
right. So it's kind of a double standard there. Great. Good myth. What are your other myths?
The next one is the fairy tale myth, and this is the one, the belief that says if you remain pure, God's going to give you your fairy tale marriage and spouse and family, and it sets up our faith as a transaction of, if I do action A, I get result B, and this was the myth that affected me the most. I really thought that I was going to get married young. I was in a serious, committed relationship in college for 3 years and thought that was going to lead to marriage, and our relationship ended, and I was really heartbroken and single for many years afterwards, and really that's when I struggled with my faith of why didn't I get this reward that I thought I was going to get for doing the right thing. And so I've come to believe that, while we do want to honor God with our choices, and while there are various ways that God blesses, I think blesses our obedience and blesses making wise decisions. It's not an automatic transaction. It's not a bargain we're making with God. If I do A, you do B, and so that turned my faith into and just into like a twisted relationship where it was like I could control God through my choices, and that was not a healthy mindset to have.
No. And perhaps you'd agree too. We will always be blessed, but sometimes those blessings aren't immediately recognized. It might happen in the next life when
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and God's best for us doesn't always feel like it at the time. And that was one of the big realizations I had to come to, was in my many years of singleness when I was yearning for marriage, was, I am living God's best for me. What I have right now, He is blessing me with His best right now. And it doesn't feel or look like God's best what I thought it would be. But I have to trust that He knows more than I do.
It's like my children that want cake for breakfast.
Yes. Yes.
My 2-year-old wants cake for breakfast, but
Yeah.
a loving parent who's a little bit wiser, I don't think cake is the best thing for her to have for breakfast.
Yes, I think about that often with my toddler too, Dan. She wants fruit snacks, and we're about to eat dinner. And I'll say, well, we're about to eat dinner, and of course, there's no concept of time with toddlers, so there's only the now. There's no concept of a few minutes. We're going to sit down and eat dinner, and I think how that's a great metaphor for God's blessings. If He would have said to me when I went through my breakup, well, just wait, in 7 years, you're going to meet your husband, and that's going to be, who I have for you. Maybe that would have helped to alleviate some of my grief at the time, or maybe it would have been like, oh no, 7 years, because that was a long time that I was single and struggling with that. But yeah, so we just have to trust God when we can't see what's coming next.
Yeah, just think of all the growth you've gone through in those 7 years, and you wouldn't be able to help people the way you are now with that.
Yeah, definitely.
That's good. But that myth is, I think, a lot of people go through crises of faith because they felt promised something, like it's the if I do this, then this is going to happen. And sometimes it's not completely correct what they had their faith or belief on. It wasn't a true principle. And that when you grew up in that society and you're being taught that if you live a chaste, pure life, you're almost guaranteed like a perfect wedding, perfect marriage, lots of children, or whatever, right? That's when that's not really what's promised.
Right. Yeah. So we could tithe faithfully 10% and not get the promotion we want, or we could pray very fervently and not be healed from maybe a chronic condition. We can also make sexual choices before marriage and then not find our spouse in the timing we thought, or maybe experience infertility when we're married and not be able to have children the way or in the timing that we want. So yeah, there's lots of ways that that we have to put our trust in God rather than our own actions and our own ability to make things happen the way we want them to.
Great. What's another myth?
The next one goes hand in hand. It's a flipped switch myth, that when you get married, you can just flip a switch and sex is going to be amazing right away with no problems, and just right away it's going to be pleasurable. And for a lot of couples, they find that this is a disappointing reality, that sex takes work. And I know that's the mission of this podcast for you, and your work is to help couples improve their intimacy and their sex life. And so for many couples, it takes work, it takes practice, it takes patience, it takes communication. It's a mutual teamwork kind of thing. It's not an instant right away, um, just you can read each other's minds kind of thing. And so, yeah, so that myth can be harmful to set us up for unrealistic expectations and a lot of shame and disappointment if it doesn't happen that way.
So how would you raise your daughter differently with this whole flip the switch thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would just want to emphasize for her that, like everything in marriage, it takes work. Communication in marriage takes work. Sex in marriage takes work. Parenting together in marriage takes work. And so all of these things require preparation and education. Like, hopefully she'll have a good sexual education, and that's something that my husband and I are working on ongoing with her, that we want to provide holistic and biblically based sexual education throughout her life, not a one-time sex talk. And so
Yes.
that's something we're trying to instill in her, so that she can be educated, but also make wise choices with what she does with her body and the relationship she's in, so that she can honor God with her body and choices.
What's the next myth?
The next one is the damaged goods myth. And so this is really harmful for people who do have premarital sex, or who, like I said, experience sexual trauma, because they then often feel like they're damaged goods, and that they're broken and dirty and tainted, and that no one's going to want them, and that God won't forgive them, or that they're not good enough for God anymore. And I just got an email recently from someone who said, my boyfriend and I had been struggling with sexual sin, but we've asked God for forgiveness. We've repented of it. We're making better choices now. We've got boundaries in place. I still feel like God wants to punish me. And my response was, if you've asked for forgiveness and repented, and you are living consistent with those values now, then God's forgiven you, and you have to release yourself of that guilt and shame too. We talked about ways to still have healthy boundaries and accountability, and making sure that she and her boyfriend were able to keep those boundaries. But as far as punishing herself and continuing to experience all that guilt and shame, I just told her she needs to let that go and know that God has paid the price for that by giving her his grace.
That's wonderful. Great. And the fifth myth.
The last one is the gatekeepers myth, the belief that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality, of men's sexuality. And so before marriage, women have to be the ones to put on the brakes and to set the boundaries so we don't cross the line, because the idea was that men were incapable of
Controlling themselves?
controlling themselves, or
Uh-huh.
not giving into temptation or lust. So that affects couples before marriage, but then after marriage, it often looks like the woman has to be the one who's always sexually available, because sex is for the man, and she has to meet his needs, and she has to give him sex a certain amount of times a week, or else he's going to look at pornography or have an affair, or just be sexually unfulfilled and unhappy with her. And of course, there's mutual responsibility in marriage and sex. So of course, we want to be sensitive to each other's needs. We want to respect each other's sexual needs and pleasure, but it's not a one-sided thing where it's just for men, and it's not something. And they're still responsible for their behavior, even if there is a time of not having sex as often. Men are still responsible for the sexual choices they make, and it's not the woman's fault. So I really push back against that idea and the unfair responsibility it puts on women.
And what about her sexual desires?
hmm Yeah, so some of purity culture was just made women to be asexual, like they have no sexual pleasure or no sexual desires at all, and that sex is just for the man. And so then you have women in marriage who don't understand their bodies, and who don't understand how to experience sexual pleasure, who don't know how to communicate that to their husbands. So they might go years in marriage without experiencing an orgasm, or without really um, experiencing much sexual pleasure, because they were taught sex is just for men.
And that's not a very intimate or erotic meaning frame in the context of a marriage, when it's all about just a duty, just something to perform. Where's the passion in that, right? That's not what you
Mhm.
want to do
Mhm.
or be.
Yeah, when it's just a duty or an obligation, there's very little pleasure with that. With anything that's a duty, I have to wash the dishes, and that's a duty or an obligation, and it's not pleasurable at all. It's not something I look forward to. So imagine feeling that way about sex and feeling like it's just for your spouse and not for yourself at all.
And
That
if you
takes
don't do
away.
it, he's going to have an affair, or he's going to go look at
Yeah,
porn, as if
yeah.
you're now responsible for his sexuality.
Yes, absolutely. And so that puts this undue guilt on women, and it really relieves men of their own responsibility and self-control when it comes to sexual just choices.
Gotcha. Yep, that'll kill passion pretty quick if you
Mhm.
live in that meaning frame too
Mhm.
long.
Yeah.
All right. So you work with your clients who grew up in this culture, and they're coming to you for help. What are the 2 or 3 tips you give them to help them work through all of this?
Mhm. Well, the first thing I start off with is really helping them to verbalize their story. What myths have affected them, in what ways has it affected them? So shame, sexual problems in their marriage, a lot of just negative messages about sex or discomfort with their bodies. There's all sorts of ways. So the number one thing would be verbalizing and validating your feelings and your experience. And secondly, it would be looking at what are the myths and the beliefs that I grew up with? Where did those come from? Who gave me those messages? What purpose did they have for giving me those messages? Like maybe what were they trying to get across to me? Like maybe they were trying to tell me that sex was a gift for marriage, but it came across as the flipped switch myth. Like, well, once you're married, it's going to be automatically great. And so looking at the reasons that they gave you those messages would be the second step. And then the third step is replacing those myths or those cultural lies with biblical truth. So I have people look through their Bible and look and read Christian books from different perspectives and talk to pastors or mentors or trusted friends and really see what is the truth about sexuality and what is God's purpose for sex, and use those truths to combat the lies that had been instilled in them for so many years.
Outside of the Bible, what are some of your favorite books that talk about this topic?
Hmm. I love Sheila Ray Gregoire. I know
Me
you've had her
too.
on the podcast before. Yeah, she is a friend of mine. I've been on her podcast, and I reviewed her book on my website and interviewed her on my Instagram. So she's awesome. And her book, The Great Sex Rescue, came out March 2nd. That's one of my favorites because it's all about identifying the harmful messages we got specifically from Christian books, and then replacing those. She has a section at the end of each chapter where she rescues and reframes those messages. So I think she's awesome. I also like Talking Back to Purity Culture by Rachel Joy Welcher. I mentioned that I'm working on a book on purity culture, and mine will be specifically how can I bring my expertise as a therapist and psychologist to this topic? How can I provide people with tools and techniques for healing? But I think Rachel does a great job of laying out the harm of purity culture and providing a really biblically based view of it. A lot of purity culture books now are really by people who are no longer Orthodox Christians, who no longer hold the belief of sexual abstinence, but Rachel does. And so I really respect her book and her message. Yeah, so those are two that I always recommend.
Fantastic. Can you talk on, so someone's coming to you, what if they don't even know what they're believing is a myth, but to them it's true, it's the only truth they know because that's all they've been told.
Mhm.
How do you help them like separate what's culture and what's theology? It's
Oh,
easy to confuse like the culture, like a good Christian culture versus theology, and sometimes they're not congruent. The culture might
yeah.
be doing one thing, and you look, even that's not just Christians, but in fact, this conversation can occur in other very patriarchal religions like
Hmm. Yeah.
Judaism and Islam too. I'm sure they have very similar concerns.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's where it comes back to separating, culture from biblical. And that can be especially hard when the messages were given by pastors or by Christian books because we take those to be biblical. We assume those are biblical, but they weren't divinely inspired by God as we believe our Bible is. So that's the step where I really help people identify the messages, who gave them to you, and why, what purpose, and then to develop their sexual ethic, like reconstruct their biblical sexual ethic through really examining what the Bible says. And I think that you can bring in all sorts of different perspectives. You can read different books, but don't take those as truth unless it's the Word of God.
Very good. Great.
Mhm.
Any tips you have for, let's say you're now working with a couple, they've worked through this and they're doing great in their marriage. Um, how would you help them even enhance or enrich their marriage or their sexual life?
Well, I think, like I said, knowing God's purpose for our sexuality, that sexuality is a gift from God, and it's a good thing. It's not something to be ashamed of, and it's not dirty. The three purposes that I believe God has for sex are procreation, because sex produces children, or it can, um, intimacy or connection, and then the third is pleasure. And so we can enjoy sexual intimacy in marriage as a connecting and intimate experience, as a way to enhance intimacy. Sometimes couples will say, like, well, like spiritual and emotional intimacy are up here, but sexual intimacy is like down here, as far as priorities or as far as like how, I don't know, holy those things are. It's like, well, God, wants us to enjoy sexual intimacy in our marriage as well. Like that's just as holy and sacred as connecting in other ways is in marriage, when it's a mutual and God honoring thing. Um,
Definitely.
s- yeah, so experiencing the intimate and the pleasurable purposes of sex too in marriage.
That's great. You can really love another person through your sexuality.
hmm Yeah, especially when it's mutual and you're considering their needs, and it's that it's experience you're sharing. I use the term share rather than give or take, because purity culture often made it seem like women are giving sex, men are taking pleasure, but it's a sharing. You're sharing this experience, you're sharing your body, you're sharing pleasure with your spouse rather than a give and take.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Um, I'd like to share some more about shame if that's something that listeners
Yes.
struggle with. Yeah. I find that that's just seems to be a universal harm when it comes to our sexuality, is we all carry some sort of sexual shame. Just regardless of, our sexual past. And so I spent a lot of time in therapy teaching people about shame and the difference between guilt and shame. And so shame and guilt are two separate emotions. Guilt is when you think I have done something wrong. So I've made a mistake, or I've sinned, I've done something bad. Um, and it can motivate us to look at our actions and recognize when our actions aren't aligned with who we want to be and our values and our character. And so it can motivate us to make changes so that our actions and our values are aligned again. But shame is I am bad, or I am wrong, or I am damaged or dirty. And so it's more of a internal focus on self rather than a focus on behavioral choices. So shame is not motivating. It just keeps people stuck in low self-esteem, or in just this struggle and this negative view of themselves, where it doesn't motivate them to make changes. It just makes them feel bad about themselves. And so there's a huge cultural component of shame too, of like, I'm going to be rejected, or I'm going to be judged, or I'm going to be looked at differently if other people knew this about me. And so I help clients learn the difference between guilt and shame, and when is that guilt justified. Like, when have you done something that goes against your values. So for like the person I got the email from, that she was falling into sexual sin with her boyfriend, that went against her values. She experienced guilt, and that motivated her to seek forgiveness, to repent to God, and to make changes in her relationship with her boyfriend. So guilt was a positive thing in that case, but it sounds like she continues to experience shame, where she's shaming herself and telling herself that she is bad and wrong, and she deserves to be punished. And so for that, I would say that shame is unjustified. And so she needs to be able to to reject that shame, and pray that God takes that away from her too. And that she doesn't let herself stay stuck in the shame.
Great.
Mhm.
And we also need to be careful not to shame others. Like, how many times have you been shamed and that's changed your behavior? Probably hasn't, right?
No, it just makes you feel judged.
Yeah. But it doesn't change. Like, being shamed about something doesn't change. Like, if you really care about someone, you don't shame them, because that doesn't really, it doesn't
It doesn't motivate you.
fruit, right? So,
Yeah, so if a parent were to catch their child in a sexual sin of some sort, having sex or pornography or something like that, rather than shaming them, which shaming them would look like, what are you doing? I can't believe you're doing that. How could you do that? That's dirty. That's wrong. Instead of
you are
shaming them,
dirty. You are wrong. You're not.
yes,
You're
yeah,
you're
and
no longer going to be as pure and white as you were before.
you're unacceptable to me.
Right.
Your sexuality or your sexual interests or desires are something to be ashamed of, or they're wrong, or they're dirty. It's more your sexual desires and your sexuality are gifts from God, but the sexual choices you make can be sinful or not sinful. And so I would rather have a parent respond with a focus on the guilt. Like, what's going on with you? They could say to their child, like, what made you make this decision? What were you thinking and feeling? What are your beliefs and what are your values about sex? And do you have guilt or shame about this? Like, what feelings do you have as a result of this? So I think exploring more what's going on with the child or with the teen, rather than just shaming them and automatically punishing them for the behaviors, it's going to get you a lot farther if you can really have a conversation about it rather than shaming them.
That's excellent.
Mm-hmm.
As a software guy, I like to think God always gives us our hardware before he gives us our software. Like, we physically mature sexually far before we're emotionally and mentally mature for sexuality, right?
Right.
So we got to also kind of make sure we kind of understand where we're coming from too, for all of us.
Yeah, and help children learn that and understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. One more thought that as you were talking about shame versus guilt, I like that story in the New Testament of the woman taken in adultery, taken before Jesus.
Yes.
And the way Jesus treated her in that situation, I think, is indicative of, like, we should also give ourselves that same self-compassion. And it may not just be sexual sins, but everyday stuff. Like, that's the good guilt that motivates to change and glorify God versus, I'm damaged and I'll never be as good as I ever was. And people are going to cast me out or stone me because of that. That's the big difference.
Yeah, I love that passage too, Dan, and I love Jesus's approach there, and that's really what I strive for in my work as a therapist, and when I write and speak about this topic, is to have that balance of grace and truth that Jesus just had so well in that passage, because he tells the woman, neither do I condemn you. So he's giving her grace, but then he says, go and sin no more, which is the truth part of, he's still calling her out of her sinful lifestyle. He still wants better for her. He wants her to experience, flourishing and health. And so he calls her out of those sin patterns, but he doesn't judge or condemn her or stone her because of her sin. So I love that balance of grace and truth.
Great. Well, I hope we can all flourish in grace and truth in our relationships and individually. Thanks for sharing what you did. If people want to reach out to you or learn more about what you do, what's a great place for them to find you?
The best place is my website, which is drcamden.com. And you'll find all my articles on purity culture there and all the podcast interviews I've done, as well as my quiz, which is called Which Purity Culture Myth Affects You? So it's a free quiz that listeners can go and take and see which of the 5 myths may still be affecting them. So that's all on my website. And then on social media, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter under the name Dr. Camden as well. So I'd love to have listeners come join me there and follow along with my work.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dan. It was nice talking with you.
Great.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.